in multi-criteria decision making, there are different elements. And I've here listed 7 of them. The first one that we have is called value. And this is generally something that you deeply care about. So for instance, you may be interested to increase the biological environment, or you may be interested to increase biodiversity, for instance, in a geographic region. The second is goal. Okay, so we're trying to articulate those different values in a problem context. Okay, so for instance, based on the example that I showed earlier about biodiversity, it may simply means we want to increase the habitat. Okay, so that may be, for instance, set aside more parcel for biodiversity or for nature protection and so on, something that we have talked about earlier in this class. The third is objective. So we have now this goal and we try to specify the goal in the terms of the desired property of the problem solution. So for instance, in the example that I talked about earlier, that may mean, for instance, that we would like to increase the habitat by at least 25% or maybe 50% of its current value. So now we're really trying to put those values and goals into some objective that is well defined. Third, we have decision maker, and I put the S here because there could be more than one. So either the decision maker is yourself, right? So for instance, in the case you are buying a car, generally you are going to be the one who makes a decision. But in the case of increasing a habitat by, let's say, 25%, right, there most likely going to be more than one stakeholder. There might be one group that is interested in protection, there might be one group that represents the town and also the budget that is available, and so on and so forth, right? So those problems generally actually have more than one decision maker. Fifth, we have decision alternatives, okay? And this is quite important. So we would like to make a decision on a particular problem. What are the alternatives? And generally alternatives are, of course, solutions that are feasible. We don't want to go into solutions that are infeasible. Go back to one of the first lectures that we had in this class talking about feasible, infeasible solution, and so on and so forth, okay? So what of these alternatives can serve as an option for a decision? 6 are the criteria. So how do we actually evaluate one alternative versus another? So in the case of increasing the habitat, it could be, for instance, how good this particular parcel or this group of parcel is to protect biodiversity, but another criterion could be, for instance, the cost to acquire those parcels. And lastly, outcomes. So those are achievement or performance of each decision alternative based on those different criteria. So how do they rank 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, okay? So those are the elements that make up a decision-making process, and now I'm going to write those into a more schematic way that may be actually easier to understand. All right, so we have talked about the different elements, and now we're going to try to represent them into a matrix format. I would like us to take a simple example of a decision making that may involve actually more than one decision maker. Let's say, for instance, you are looking to rent an apartment and you and your spouse or you and your partner are trying to make a decision among different alternatives, and both of you have different criteria that you actually really care about. Okay. So our goal here is then to rent an apartment. Let's suppose there are 2 decision makers, okay, you and your spouse, and you have different objectives. So for you, one of the objectives may be to focus on the proximity to school, because you are going to go to campus. Okay, your spouse may be working in town, and so maybe that is less of an importance factor to her or to him. The second objective could be the price, and the price would most likely be something that both decision makers do care about. Okay, while maybe for your spouse, the third objective may be whether or not the apartment can accommodate, let's say, pets like dogs or cats. So here you can see the sort of hierarchy. Okay, now once we have those different objectives set up, we can think about different attributes that will allow us actually to quantify the different alternatives, and then here for each row we have the different alternatives. So these different alternatives could be different apartments, apartment 1, apartment 2, apartment 3, 4, and they are M alternatives. Okay, and the attributes here, they are multiple attributes here up to N. Now usually when you rent an apartment, they're not going to be 100 different attributes to take into consideration. They might be maybe 5, 6, or 7. Okay, so let's think about these objective first, right? So that was your objective, and you say you would like to have some proximity. Proximity, maybe. What does that mean? To be close to different amenities? Well, maybe you want to be close to a grocery store. Maybe you want to be close to a park. Maybe you want to be close to school that you're going to attend, and so on and so forth. So they could be different attributes, and this could simply be distance to school, distance to the grocery store, and this could also be, for instance, distance to a park. Okay. The second objective, remember, we're talking about affordability, right? And that could be, of course, the rent. That's very important. But that could also be maybe whether or not there is a parking and whether or not we have to pay for parking. So that could be another example. While the third objective here may be whether or not pets are allowed, and that would be actually a binary attribute, 0, 1 being 1 it's allowed and 0 it's not allowed. So now we have those different attributes and we have those different alternatives, and then there is an outcome for each of them. Okay, so an outcome here could be, right, so if this one here was the price, right, you would have a price for each of these different alternatives. So just writing here, so for instance one of them could be $500, right, maybe for this one it could be maybe $600, and so on and so forth, and maybe for this one it could be maybe $450. Okay, so now you do have a value for each of these attributes and each of these alternatives. The very last row here are actually the preference, right? The preference, and so these essentially you are going to give weights to each of these attributes. Now, I wouldn't be surprised that in the case of an apartment, right, one of the criteria would be the price, okay? Unless you're making tons of money, that is going to be a very important factor. And the same when you buy a house, when you buy a car, and things of that nature, right? So this is where you're going to give the weight, okay? And based on that, you will be able to multiply the weights with the attributes and then come up with essentially at the end the alternative that ranks the best among your different objectives, and ultimately leading you to make a choice.